Since the horrific Uvalde shooting in May, Texas officials have done everything they can to protect the state's guns and comfort the people who own them while doing very little to help fearful parents. In that vein, Texas schools are handing out safety kits that encourage parents to collect their children's DNA and fingerprints in case of an emergency. These kits are labeled a gift of safety from our family to yours, right under a great big giant seal of the state of Texas. Why is Texas sending DNA kits to parents? Our experts weigh in, coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Given that some of the 19 students murdered at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde had to be identified using DNA samples, the distribution of these safety kits, collecting DNA and fingerprints from parents or causing parents to collect them from kids, have left some parents devastated. This morning, I'm talking to a parent who lives in Texas who received one of these DNA kits. Her name is Tracy Walder. Not only is she a Texas parent, but she's also a former CIA and FBI agent. She's a current college professor who spent 14 years teaching in a public school in Texas. Good morning and welcome, Tracy.
Thank you so much for having me, Areva.
Wow, I'm a parent of 3 kids, and I share in your devastation. I can't even imagine living in Texas during this moment where school shootings have been just so rampant all throughout the country. We just saw another school shooting yesterday in St. Louis, which is my hometown. And to not have officials step up and deal with the gun problem in this country, but to hand out a DNA kit that they're calling a gift from our family to yours. Just tell me, what were you thinking when you heard the news or when you yourself as a parent received this kit?
I think my initial thought was I was horrified. I think that there's really, it's disturbing and quite frankly, it's insulting to couch this as a gift of safety. If they truly believed in safety for our children, Texas is spending all this money to fortify schools. There's discussions about arming teachers. And just like you mentioned before about that horrific school shooting in St. Louis, that school had metal detectors and still a shooter got in. And they are literally doing everything other than what the root of the problem is, which is access to basically weapons of war.
Uvalde, so you are in Texas. I know you live in the Dallas area. You're not in Uvalde, but help us understand, in that case, some of those kids were unrecognizable. They literally had to take DNA samples from the parents to identify their children. Now they're asking parents all over the state, presumably, to collect it in advance for them so they could have this on file. There's so many things that run through my mind about privacy and, who's going to handle these kits. And you worked in these 2 major security agencies, the CIA and FBI. Is there anything from your security hat? I know how you feel from a parent hat, but help us understand what happened in Uvalde when you put on your security law enforcement hat. And what this might mean for other parents besides those parents who had to already go through this horrific experience in Uvalde.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I think about. When I worked at the CIA, I served in multiple war zones. One of them included Afghanistan, and we did carry weapons very similar to an AR-15. And those are designed to be weapons of war. Those are designed to inflict maximum damage. That's the point, right? Is to kill your enemy on the battlefield. But schools aren't battlefields, and we don't live in a battlefield every day. And so the problem is you have, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who can in a state like Texas and other states as well, easily access these weapons of war. And that is the common denominator here. That's a weapon that's being used in, I would say, 90% of the school shootings. And when you have a weapon like that, that's designed to inflict multiple damage, you want to ensure that you are killing your enemy. And I know that sounds very blunt, but that's what we do, right? When we're in war, and that's a very common thing. And I think that's really the core of the issue. And I think the fact that these children were unrecognizable, if that doesn't force people to want to enact change, and I said this before after Sandy Hook, if we are okay with a bunch of kindergartners and first graders basically being killed, then I don't think we have a threshold in terms of when we're going to limit access to these types of weapons. And, I think what's upsetting to me about these DNA kits is here in Texas, it's really being couched as, help us if your child is kidnapped, help us, if your child is exploited in the sex trade. And really that's inappropriate, because you are also encouraging parents really to do these DNA kits. I had to have my DNA on file when I worked at the CIA and the FBI, but I understood that was a calculated risk that I took as an adult. And we are basically treating schools like battlefields, like fortified fortresses, and that is highly problematic.
And what message, Tracy, does it send to the parents in Texas if the solution, or one of the solutions after Uvalde, is now let's collect DNA and fingerprints? I mean, like you said, as an adult, you made a choice to work for a law enforcement agency that says we have to have your DNA and your fingerprints. And that's perfectly fine. You made that choice. But I can't imagine that, that's the most logical thing that would come to the minds of these administrators when trying to keep kids safe at school. So what message is that sending to you about the safety of your schools in Texas?
I think what that's saying to me is look, like there's two different ways that I look at this. I don't look at this as the fault of my school district, right? Or my school administrators. I'm not sure that they had anything to do, right, in the procurement of these kits. But what that tells me directly is that our governor or our government does not care ultimately about the safety of my child or really any other child in that classroom. What they care about is simply making money off of the gun lobby. They are not willing to touch that. So their pocketbooks, I know this sounds harsh, mean more, quite frankly, than the life of my child. I mean, really, that's what that's telling me.
Yeah, no, it's not harsh. I think we have to talk about it in unapologetic terms. We can't sugarcoat it, because when school districts decide through their government, through the governor of Texas, to take these kinds of actions, I think we have to, as parents and as advocates, stand up and let people know what these actually, what's happening here. Now, did you have to have a conversation with your daughter about this quote unquote safety kit and the taking of DNA and fingerprints? And what does that conversation look like?
I so appreciate you asking that question, because it's a very complex issue, particularly here in Texas. So I do media hits on MSNBC and things like that. And I think my daughter is perhaps exposed to more things than she should. That's our choice. She knows about George Floyd. She knows about these issues. We choose to have those conversations with her because we think that that's important as parents to do. She's 7. We obviously speak to her in an age appropriate way, but we do think she needs to know about these complexities in the world. She does know about Uvalde. Obviously, she doesn't know the minute details of it. But if I personally will not use these DNA kits, but let's say that I did, I would have to have a conversation with her about why am I swabbing her cheek? And so I know when my daughter had overheard me doing some things about Uvalde, and she went and, talked to her classmates just about some of the things. I actually got in trouble as a parent for my daughter then speaking at school to her classmates and, quote, scaring them. And so it's very interesting. You don't want me to have these conversations, right, with my second grader, but at the same time, you're forcing me to have these conversations. And I quite frankly think that it is the appropriate thing to do as a parent, especially as someone who's former law enforcement, to equip my daughter with the tools to if God forbid she's ever in a school shooting, come out alive. And so it's this really strange dichotomy that we have, particularly here, is, you have parents that are upset with me, for my 7-year-old bringing that information to school, and then at the same time they're okay with these DNA kits and not doing anything about gun control. So it's a weird
irony.
Yes.
Yeah, it's ironic because I'm sitting here thinking about these school active shooter drills. They're getting on you as a parent for talking to your 7-year-old, but they're conducting these drills. They have to tell the kids something about, why are we doing an active shooter drill? So you're right. I can't even imagine what your school said to you, because you have a right as a parent to talk to your child, and children have access to this information on TV, on the internet, through other kids. So I think it's great that you're talking to your 7-year-old. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
And whoever these bullies are at your school who are trying to prevent you from talking to your kids, that's not the solution. No. Unfortunately, our kids are exposed to way too much. And let's take the effort to do something about the shootings rather than continuing to expose our kids. I want to bring into the conversation Carrie Rodriguez. She's the president of the National Parents Union. And Carrie talks to parents, works with parents all over this country. And Carrie, welcome, and thanks for returning to the show. What are the parents you're talking to? How are they feeling in this moment about how districts or states like Texas are responding to these mass shootings?
Well, frankly, we're horrified by it. And I think exactly what we're talking about today is the problem. The only thing that is ever going to address this issue of gun violence and mass shootings in our schools is taking the guns out of circulation, to getting them out of the hands of people who are going to commit these kinds of atrocities. That's the bottom line. This is not a situation that we don't know the solution for. We just don't have the political will or the backbone to actually do what other countries have had to do in terms of really enacting powerful, assault weapons, protections, making sure, like all of these, literally it's right in front of us. Less guns, less incidents of mass shootings. That's what needs to happen. So as parents, again, I would love to be able to wrap my kids in bubble wrap, and make sure that, I bought them the bulletproof backpack. Do you know that's a thing now, that you can actually go online, and if you're really worried about this, you can buy your child a bulletproof backpack that they can put in front of themselves so that you can have that extra This is where we are right now. So actually, and this is a commonality across the country, regardless of geography or demographics, we're horrified the fact that, we literally place more value on guns than we do on our children.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, Carrie, about bulletproof backpacks. Tracy, I'm sure that sounds a lot like what you would have when you were in a war zone in Afghanistan. There were I'm sure, this equipment that, the United States provided to you to keep you safe and to protect you. Again, not the kind of equipment that children, but if they're getting DNA kits, what's going to stop them from saying, we want kids to show up at school in bulletproof vests or to have bulletproof backpacks? That could be the logical extension of where this line of thinking from governors like the governor in Texas takes us.
Well, to your point, actually, about the backpacks, Carrie, I totally agree with everything you have said. And Dallas ISD, so the district here, actually is requiring students to have clear backpacks. So, we're not talking about Kevlar, but we're talking about clear, so that way you can see if someone has brought a gun to school. And I don't think that you are too far off, in saying that. When I left the FBI, we have custom made Kevlar vests that fit our bodies and all of that. And I had to turn that in, which is fine. There's the expectation that I am not going to need that, right, as a private citizen. But, I think that we are, in a way, I don't think it's outside of a realm of possibility to be asking for bulletproof backpacks. Carrie's right. You can purchase those online. I have not purchased one, but you can. And Dallas ISD does require clear backpacks. So, and it's in response. It was just this year, and it was in response to the Uvalde shooting. So I don't think you're far off on that at all.
And Carrie, what about those parents that you've talked to across the country who are gun owners and who may think that this is perfectly okay, that they support the DNA emergency kits. Are you running into, I mean, are you talking to a lot of those parents? And if so, what percentage of, do those parents represent, of the parents overall that you talk to?
Well, I will say we do have a lot of affiliated groups in Texas, many of whom are gun owners, but responsible gun owners are not in support of things like this in my experience. Again, these are not solutions that actually address the problems, right? Clear backpacks. The Uvalde shooting was not the result of someone like a second grader bringing in a gun in a back. Like that's not even getting to the actual issue of what literally happened, or trying to provide some kind of tactic or protection. So what it seems like is we're trying to literally do everything other than the thing that needs to be done, because it's going to make, again, the gun lobby very uncomfortable. And until we make folks uncomfortable enough, and that's why we feel it's really important as parents that, we organize, we come together, we hold elected officials accountable, especially our school boards, so that, they actually start using their positions of power to hold, other elected officials accountable, including governors, to start doing the right thing. Because the fact of the matter is, it's so sad, but we've had classrooms filled with first graders just completely mowed down, and nothing changed. Last year in Uvalde, that's a classroom full of kids. You want to talk about talking to your kids. Those kids all look exactly like mine. I had to have a very hard conversation with third and fourth graders in my home about, this could literally happen anywhere, and I can't guarantee it's not going to happen to them. So I honestly, this is a point of anxiety and frustration, I think, for parents across the country, because we just don't have the political backbone to get done what needs to happen now.
And Tracy, last question for you. Big election coming up in less than 2 weeks. What happens in Texas? Beto O'Rourke is on the ballot for governor for the state of Texas. He's run before. He hasn't been successful. He is a big gun control advocate, and he's been all over, the state, all over the nation talking about it. But last polls I saw, he was not polling ahead of your current governor. So if this is such a big issue for parents, why don't we see pro-gun control advocates like Beto O'Rourke doing better?
That is an excellent question, and I'm not certain that I have the answer for you. I mean, look, I obviously am a fan of Beto's, and I will be voting for him. I make no bones about that. I also think, to Carrie's point about organization, I do think that sometimes I think that there's teachers who really need to be organized to come out and really start speaking about how this affects them and in the classroom. We're hearing a lot from elected officials about it and how it's affecting them, and don't take my guns. And I think that's what a lot of people are thinking here in Texas, is Beto is coming for all of your guns. And that's not going to happen, because I don't think the Second Amendment is ever going to be overturned. But I think that messaging then gets out of control. And a lot of people here, then that's what they assume. And, as a teacher myself in high school, I had a lot of students who used to say, Mrs. Walter, the school shooting happens, we are so glad that we're in your classroom. You would help us. And, but the fact of the matter is that I'll be very vulnerable for a second. I didn't get into teaching to die. Right. I got into teaching to make a difference, right, and impact the lives of future students. I don't know what I would do. I don't know if I would put myself in front of a school shooter. Now, the CIA and FBI, yes, that's my job. But as a teacher, it's not. And I think we really need to harness our teachers better in terms of advocating for this message. I think it's one thing that Texas is doing well and is not doing enough of.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. And great point. Wow, what a lot of pressure from your students to think that because they're in your class that they would be protected in a way differently than if they were in someone else's class. You are a mom yourself. So in that classroom of those kids, you're also going to be thinking about what happens to your own 7-year-old if something, a shooting happens in your classroom. That's too much pressure for a teacher. I mean,
it is.
That's too much pressure for anyone. I don't know about your students. Tell them you love them, but don't ask you to, sacrifice your life. Ask them to have their parents vote that governor out of office. That's a much easier choice that can be done. That's something much easier that can be done. Thank you, Tracy. I know you have to go, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Eric's going to stick around. We're going to add to this conversation. Now, Nick Wilson, he's a senior director of gun violence prevention at Center for American Progress, and Marjolaine Armstrong, she's a law professor at the University of Santa Clara Law School. Good morning, Professor Armstrong, and good morning, Nick. So glad to have you all join this conversation. So, Nick, what was the response at your organization when you heard about this plan that the Texas government has to send DNA kits to parents?
That's a great question. I think at first we were both shocked, but then I think the more we thought about it, the less surprised we were. I think in the 2021 regular legislative session in Texas was reeling from back-to-back shootings in El Paso, Midland, Odessa. 80 people were shot between these two shootings. And so we were hoping that there would actually be passing gun laws to strengthen gun laws. But instead, they went ahead and weakened gun laws, and they passed a bill to get rid of all requirements if you wanted to carry a gun. So no longer would people have to get 6 hours of training, pass a written exam to make sure they know what the Texas gun laws are, a basic shooting proficiency test to prove that they can safely handle a firearm. So instead of strengthening laws, they weakened them. Following the shooting, we elevated the voices of Uvalde families who called on Abbott to call for a special session to raise the minimum age to 21 for the purchase of assault weapons. A very modest change, but could be helpful in preventing some of these shootings. And of course, the conservative legislator and Governor Abbott refused to even call a session to have a discussion. So it's been business as usual in Texas.
Professor Marjolaine, what we hear from those gun advocates like the ones that Nick just talked about, the conservatives in the Texas legislature, is this, almost blind belief in the Second Amendment as giving them unfettered rights to possess guns. We heard that in the debate recently between Val Demings and Marco Rubio, that U.S. Senate debate that they had for the Senate seat in Florida. Val Demings was challenging Marco Rubio about the lack of national gun laws or gun control laws, and he said Second Amendment. Everybody in this country has a right to carry a gun. Have we misinterpreted what the Second Amendment means and the rights that it provides to individual citizens?
Well, the Supreme Court this summer in the New York Rifle Association versus Bruin case said that there is pretty much an absolute right to carry a gun for self-defense without having any special justification to show the government that you need a gun. And so the Supreme Court struck down the New York regulations that made it that required people to justify why they would have a concealed carry permit. And so the Supreme Court this summer pretty much burst open the door, which was being pushed open, kind of incrementally. It just opened it wide with Justice Thomas's decision. And I think that there really is a misinterpretation of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary. People have the right not to have the federal government put restrictions on their arms. And this gets extended to states with the 14th Amendment. But the context of the Second Amendment was, first of all, the Revolutionary War. Secondly, the fact that people were needed and were required in some instances to be available to serve as militia people for two purposes, really. One was fighting Native Americans, and the other was catching escaped slaves. And so if you were a slave owner, you were required in many states to be a part of the militia. And if you didn't become a part, you could pay someone to serve for you. And of course, with respect to the Indians or Native American suppression, that was constantly an issue as Europeans kept pushing further and further west. But that was the context for the Second Amendment. And so to change it into something about having a personal right without any reference to regulation, I really don't understand why well-regulated has kind of disappeared from the court's Second Amendment discourse.
Do you see anything that would be inconsistent with the Second Amendment, or how enacting reasonable gun laws, like requiring universal background checks, banning the sale of assault weapons, limiting magazine capacities, or raising the age for gun ownership to 21, do you see any of those being inconsistent with the rights provided under the Second Amendment?
Well, these military weapons are really inconsistent with the idea of self-defense. I mean, do you keep one under your bed if there's a burglar in your house? Do you walk down the street with one in order to deter people from attacking you or assaulting you? I just don't think that the kind of weapons that people have access to now are consistent with the idea of protecting yourself or protecting your family. As the previous speaker said, these were weapons that were used to serve military purposes, to destroy people from a long distance, and a lot of people. And so the idea that anybody would need that for self-defense seems pretty ridiculous. Now, another interpretation that a lot of people who are gun advocates say is that people need to have this kind of weaponry to be able to fight the government if they need to. And so there's an awful lot of talk about upcoming civil war. And if a civil war happened, it would really be people who were fighting against the government. We don't have Confederate states that are going to band together and succeed. We're talking about people versus people and people versus the government, somewhat like we saw on January 6th.
Yeah, I guess it's so bothersome to me, Carrie, what Tracy said about these assault weapons being used in military settings, DNA being collected by CIA and FBI for, again, law enforcement and folks who are going to be in these settings. What stops schools next from having kids wear dog tags like soldiers do? Soldiers wear dog tags as a way of identifying them if something happens to them in war. It seems like these states are taking every, measure that they can to put the onus on the parents and the kids rather than on the lawmakers to make these common sense changes to their gun laws. How do we as parents stop them?
It's almost like preemptively blaming the victim here. And listen, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. Like, I don't know how you're a conservative who, believes in libertarian-esque kind of principles around, your right, your individual freedom to own a gun. And at the same time, you're willing to give up that freedom by giving your child's DNA to the state. So, like, to me, the cognitive dissonance that must be going on in the heads of some of these people, like, I can't explain it. It must be exhausting. But
people aren't required to give it to the state. They keep it at home. And so only if there is some tragedy is the DNA given to the state. And I think it's important to realize that, because if you look at the debates online that have been occurring with respect to this rule, some people assume that this is just more information the government's trying to collect about people, when in fact, it's like, parents, you keep this in case there's something that happens to your kid. And what isn't said is that you might need DNA of your child, because like in Uvalde, where those assault weapons were used, your child may be unrecognizable because of the force of the weapons that are used. And I think that in itself is really an admission by the state or the school board in Texas that we just aren't going to protect our children from that kind of weaponry and destruction.
I agree. It's like we've conceded the fact that this is eventually going to happen to you. You should hold on to this DNA because we may need it at some point to help identify your child, because they're literally going to be blown into pieces in their first or second grade classroom. I mean, can we sit with that for a minute and say, like, as a society, we're okay with that? It's horrific, but that's literally what we need to start saying and not pulling any punches around it. You know, in terms of, you know, a lot of this stuff, the idea that it's commonplace now that our kids go through these Alice drills where they're taught how to hide and what to do if someone's coming into the school or into their classroom, or understanding why there are locks on the insides of the door so that the teacher can barricade. I mean, and some of these things, frankly, you know, going to the earlier discussion as well, if you have an active shooter with an AR-15 telling kids to flip their desks over, it's going to do little to nothing to prevent them from actually literally being blown apart. So again, parents and activists like me, I don't know what else we can do. We have done everything we possibly can to call the question, to literally put the values in front of folks. Like, do you understand that you're asking parents to accept the eventuality that our children could possibly be blown into bits, and we will have to gather up their DNA to determine whether or not they were in this classroom? Like, I don't even know how you have a discussion with lawmakers or policymakers who understand what we're being asked and seem to be okay with that. To me, that goes to your moral compass, who you are as a human being. And if you are so married to politics and what you're getting from the NRA and other lobbyist groups, that you value that more than literally what we're talking about here, our children being blown apart and having to be identified by DNA, I don't even know how you approach a conversation with people like that.
Yeah, Nick, in your work, obviously, you're talking to a lot of people, and Carrie is saying it's incomprehensible, the level of hypocrisy, the irony. But this is where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a state, you know, election like Texas coming up, where Beto O'Rourke is polling behind the Texas incumbent Republican governor, even though the Republican governor, despite Uvalde, despite those 80 shootings that you just talked about, those 80 deaths that happened, you know, in succession in that state, still being unwilling, and not even being unwilling, even going further, as you said, to make guns more available to every person that lives in Texas. So is there something we're missing here? You know, are we in the minority? Or are we, you know, on this show in the minority?
We're definitely not in the minority. Most of the things that we're talking about, you know, poll in the 80, 90%. When Texas rolled back some of their laws in 2021, you know, the Texas Police Association, the Texas Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, folks that are normally, you know, identified as conservative, they were very vocally against these bills, but they said that a very small vocal minority that always votes on one issue really were able to pass these. And, you know, the governor was happy to appease these voters, despite it being opposed by most Texans and by most law enforcement. That's going to put their lives at danger and make their jobs a lot more difficult.
Nick, if that's the case, if you're saying groups that normally aren't in coalition, like this Texas, you know, law enforcement union, standing with parents, why is the governor polling ahead of the guy that says, I'll do the opposite? Because people, you said, are against the law that, you know, made guns more available in the state of Texas, but yet the support for the governor who signed the bill is still pretty high.
Yeah, we have some real structural issues in this country that prevent very popular policies from gun violence to abortion from being mainstream. Part of that is gerrymandering. Some of that is the outside influence of the corporate gun lobby and the money that the NRA is spending on these elections. And also the Republicans are very good at throwing disingenuous attacks. We saw John Fetterman being attacked on crime, and he's done a great job of connecting the rising violent crime to these weak gun laws. And we've seen Governor Whitmer, Governor Walz do a great job. But, you know, Texas is a very difficult place. We're seeing momentum building, but it's a tough. And the part that I just find really motivating is that the Texas had the gall to say this is a gift of safety from our family to yours. When this is no safety, this is identifying a body that's been mutilated. A real gift of safety would be requiring a permit to purchase a firearm, extreme risk protection orders, where there's millions and millions of dollars available to Texas, thanks to Biden's Bipartisan Safer Community Act, to find ways to prevent these shootings from happening in the first place, requiring safe storage of firearms if there's children there. And as we've talked about banning assault weapons, because one person can kill way too many people and do way too much damage to these bodies. That's really what safety is about. And so I think Beto is doing a great job of making that argument that if we're concerned about crime and keeping our communities safe, we need to address the gun laws.
It really has to go beyond schools. So many shootings have been occurring in places that are just public places, like the Highland Park Parade, like shopping centers. It's really, when you have unfettered gun possession, you can't expect to be safe anywhere.
And I will say, if I could just give you the political point as well, because our poll of K through 12 parents who are registered voters, we ask these questions and ask whether or not, where are your priorities? What are you voting around this year? And the fact of the matter is this is going to be an economic election. And even though these things are happening in our schools and parents are horrified by it, and it's terrible, and it is a priority, the top priority right now is the fact that they're having a difficult time making ends meet. They're living paycheck to paycheck and living on the edge. So a lot of the time, the economic arguments that are being made right now are resonating because we are living on the edge and our families are really in crisis. So that a Republican with a talking point around the economy and blaming Democrats for the situation we are in with an impending recession, you might outweigh this issue, unfortunately, although many of us think it shouldn't.
But Carrie, let me ask you this. Poor families have been living on the edge throughout their entire lives. So there's nothing new about poor families and, low-income families being on the edge. So I think we have to fight back against, that narrative that somehow this year economically is so much worse. It may be worse for those people who've, flourished, but poor families have been poor. And they've always been living, paycheck to paycheck, and always have suffered from food insecurity and housing insecurity and job insecurities. So how, and I'll ask you this, Nick, has that narrative caught hold, the one that Carrie just described? And I don't doubt that it has, but how do we counter that narrative? Because poor people have always been poor. There's nothing new about this so-called recession. And we know Republicans have no track record in doing anything once they're in office to help poor people feel less anxiety about their situation. So it's not like they're going to be able to wave a magic wand around inflation or gas prices that are, a global issue. And we know they're not going to enact any kind of economic or fiscal policies that are going to put more money in the pockets of poor people. Because we had the child tax credit. That actually put $300 per child in the pockets of poor and working class parents, and they voted against it. We have Social Security. They said in 5 years they want to sunset Social Security. Social Security puts money in the hands of poor people. So how is it that somehow the Republicans are gaining in this narrative that they're going to help these anxious, poor, and working class families? Because they vetoed and voted against everything right now that could put money in the hands of poor people.
I think this is a perennial issue for Democratic strategists. I mean, going back to trickle-down economics, and for some reason, voters really, when they're concerned about economic insecurity or inflation or gas prices, a lot of times they trust the Republicans because of the image they've created as these businessmen, even though they're unable to reduce the deficit or make meaningful changes in people's lives. And so as a policy person, I like to think that our studies and our research really makes a difference. But in fact, when it comes time to, down to the wire, like it is now in the midterms, I think we just need to do a better job around really speaking to the concerns. When we talk about violent crime, our polling and our research shows that you can't just say, oh, actually, violent crime is not that bad. We're safer than the 90s. You have to really say everyone deserves to feel safe in their community and recognize that there are real concerns, but that we have the best policies to respond to that. And we can and the Republicans will say, oh, it's, progressive prosecutors, it's bail reform, it's all these other boogeymen, they're Democratic mayors that are failing. when really gun violence and violent crime is up in rural areas even more than in urban areas. And the 9 out of the 10 most violent states are led by Republicans. And so we need to do a better job of really making that message to voters and cutting through kind of the noise. And it's just unfortunate that a lot of times it takes a tragedy for people to get involved. It's been really inspiring to see the Uvalde families really come into this political awakening. We've noticed it with Parkland. And now, there's a great article in the Washington Post about a 10-year-old Caitlin in Uvalde who's, was worried about getting invited to a sleepover, a year ago. And now she's talking to senators and congressmen and asking them to please do something so that way she doesn't have to continue to visit other friends' graves. And so it's up to all of us to vote and to demand our leaders that they don't kind of push this to the side. And we really take on this issue. We don't resort back to these 1990s tough on crime talking points, because that won't make us safer. We need to strengthen the gun laws. We need to invest in housing and employment and mental health services and all the other things that we do know that works.
So, Carrie, you've done this parent poll, and you said that economics is polling the highest amongst parents. In that poll, did you test some of these messages? Because what Nick says is that oftentimes people, fall for these Republican talking points that somehow they're businessmen and they know how to deal with the economy better, and that smaller government somehow benefits everyone. Are those some of the messages that you guys polled in this poll?
So we don't actually test those messages, but we really try to take the temperature of American parents to make sure that we're understanding exactly where their priorities are and how they're going to vote and whether or not they are going to vote. And frankly, we know that parents as a voting bloc are actually going to be pretty powerful this year, with 82% of American families who are registered voters saying they are highly motivated to get out and vote during these midterms. But their priorities are things like the economy, things like public safety, things like abortion, as well as our nation's public schools. But when you ask the question of those who really prioritize public education, number 1 is school safety. Number 2 is mental health. And number 3 is addressing learning loss that we've seen as the result of the pandemic. So for parents that are highly motivated to get to the polls during the midterms, that care deeply about public education, it's not all this CRT stuff that we've been talking about and distracted by. It's literally keeping our kids safe. 68% of American families saying that is their top priority, and immediately 67% also saying that mental health and the fact that we're in a crisis right now are their priorities. But we cannot. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum for parents and families, and we've got to recognize that a lot of people are feeling pain in this moment. We did have the end of the child tax credit, and there are a lot of families that were literally relying on that to make it work in their homes, and they're feeling that pressure. They're looking for somebody to blame, and we know that this happens during the midterms. Whoever's elected, whoever's got the control of Congress, usually pays the price during an economic downturn. And I think they're looking for someone who's going to tell them that they feel their pain, they understand that, and that they're going to do something about it.
But Carrie, I guess I'm curious. Your parents are motivated to vote in the elections, which is good to hear. They're looking for someone that feels their pain. Do your parents look at the track record, not just the messages? Because Nick, yes, there are the messages of who is best equipped to deal with the economy, and then there's the reality of what these people have done when they are in office. We know Trump brought some of the Parkland kids to the White House when he was in office and said, I'm going to do something about this. So saying you're going to do something about it and then doing something about it is totally different. So are parents going beyond the slick campaign messages and looking at like who voted against the child tax credit that was putting money in their pockets? Because it doesn't matter what these politicians say. They have a track record.
Well, listen, I would love to tell you yes. I would love to say yes and say, yes, they're thinking deeply about this, but also being a mama of 5 little boys and a full-time working mom and knowing like the reality of this and talking to parents every single day. No, we don't have time to do it. We live in a 140 character society. You got to tell me quickly. And, frankly, I'm a Democrat. I'm a proud member of the Democratic State Committee of Massachusetts. And I will tell you, we get in the weeds, we get into the gray area, we get into the nuance. We got to be more effective as messengers to spit it out, say what we mean, be unequivocal about it, because that's where we've always been beat. It's not on the actual issues. It's about how we articulate them, how we communicate them in a way that, you can get in there, say what you mean, be very, John Fetterman is actually beautiful at doing this. He's a wonderful example, but we are far too nuanced, far too nice. And that's why Republicans quite often win that messaging game.
Yeah, that's so sad because Professor Armstrong, we're talking about, the reality is that parents care about public safety. So Kerry's poll shows that parents do care about public safety. They care about school safety, but yet they continue to elect politicians whose solution to public safety is clear backpacks, DNA test kits, finger, prints, metal detectors in schools, and other things that we know have just proven to be completely ineffective. I mean, there's not a school shooting that's taken place yet where any of those measures, the backpack, the second graders aren't coming to school with the assault rifles. The people are coming, these 18, 19-year-old kids are coming off, they're coming from away from the campus. They're not embedded in these schools oftentimes. So how do we get that message across? Kerry said we have a messaging problem. How do we get the message across that these measures are not working?
Well, there's not only a messaging problem, there's a structural problem in terms of the fact that so many states have had Republican legislatures, with the Republican strategy being voter dilution and discouraging people from going out to vote. So structurally, it's harder to get people who are suffering to the polls because of difficulty registering, difficulties on the day that voting occurs, and you have legislation that doesn't encourage people to vote, but kind of discourages people to vote. And so one of the things that's most effective is getting out the vote, even though it's very difficult because of the structure of things. But we saw what happened in Georgia and the election of the senators. That was amazing, and that was because of getting out the vote. So people like Stacey Abrams have been very effective in terms of getting people who vote the issues in intelligent ways, or in ways that are informed by their own interest, to the polls.
All right, Nick, last question for you. What should we be doing? We got 2 weeks, maybe even not 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks before these midterm elections. Obviously, these are big, complex problems, not going to be solved overnight. But what marching orders would you give us, or, families that are out there that are feeling anxious about their kids who may have been given one of these DNA, emergency kits? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I think there's always these motivating things that get people involved into politics that maybe aren't as involved. We see a lot around school shootings with shooter drills and children coming back to the parents saying how kind of traumatizing it is to go through these active shooter drills. I think these DNA testing is just one more example that our government is, and a lot of our leaders are not serious about keeping us safe and keeping our families safe. After Uvalde, we saw law enforcement and government officials blocking any efforts of transparency to find out what happened and to learn from that. And so I think not only do we need to vote in this election and make sure that we get our friends and family to vote. My mother lives in Arizona. Fox News has gotten a hold of her. I still call her to be like, please vote for Mark Kelly. She's like, he's a communist. I'm like, no, he's not a communist. He's a hero. We need to vote. We need to have these difficult conversations. But we also need to get involved at the school board level and the local level and really put it back onto our elected leaders to come up with answers to keep us safe, because it shouldn't be up to family members to have to decide, should we keep this DNA for our kids? Should we buy these bulletproof backpacks? Should we be scared to take kids to, after school sporting events where we've seen an unprecedented number of shooting events at school sports this year? And so we need to vote, but we also need to get more involved, sustain involved, because it's easy for politicians to, once they get elected, to just compromise or kind of wish our issue away when it's not convenient. And we need to become more like our opponents that are always asking about this issue and demanding safety. So that's what I would ask. And there's no easy answers. But yeah, this is the time to vote.
Always a good time to vote. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Professor Armstrong. Such an important issue, and we are less than 2 weeks away from these very important midterm issues. I hope that all of us will use our voices and our platforms to help people understand that it's not, the slick ad campaigns or messages, but it's really the track record of, these folks who are asking to be placed in these positions of power. These folks who are making decisions that not just impact, our economic lives, but our safety. And in many ways, this is a matter of life or death, particularly as it relates to our kids. When they go into these classrooms, they should not have to worry about a shooter drill or a locked door or a clear backpack, or, whether they left their fingerprints at home for their parents. They go to school to learn, to socialize, and to grow. And we want to support them in every way that we can. So thank you guys for all the work that you're doing to help our kids be safe in schools. I just want to thank my guests this morning for the advocacy that they have done and that they continue to do around this issue. Public safety in schools should be, and I can imagine is, a top priority for all parents. It must be so anxiety inducing to send your kids to school, particularly in a state like Texas, where there have been so many school shootings, and having to wonder what might happen if your kid is going to be safe, if they are going to return. And oh my God, my heart goes out to Tracy. Tracy having her high school students ask her basically to put her body in front of theirs in case of a school shooting. No teacher should be asked to make that kind of sacrifice. Teachers don't go to school to die. She already served in the FBI, in the CIA. She made a conscious choice as an adult to put herself in harm's way when she took those jobs and took those assignments. But that's not the assignment that teachers in this country take. And we as a society, we as states and school districts need to make sure we are protecting not only our kids, but our teachers. If we want the best and the brightest to continue to go into the teaching profession, which we need in order to educate the next generation of leaders, we've got to make sure that teachers feel like these are safe jobs, that these school districts and governors have their backs. And I agree with Tracy. I'd love to see more teachers speaking out, joining forces with students. I'd love to see more law enforcement agencies speaking out and joining forces with teachers and with students and with parents. Because as Nick told us, there are more Americans in this country that believe that reasonable gun control laws should be enacted at both the federal and the state level. Our voices may not be as loud right now, but they can be. There's no reason why the majority can't be louder than the minority. And there's no reason why the majority of us that care about school safety can't speak with a louder voice than those few that think that they have unfettered rights to assault weapons. And there's no reason that we can't use our voices and then use our votes to vote out of office folks like the governor of Texas, folks like Marco Rubio in Florida, and all of those folks who refuse to accept that gun safety can be achieved in this country, that the answer's right there. But it will never be achieved as long as they are cowards and as long as they are in the pockets of gun lobbyists and the big gun manufacturers. Let's call them out, and then let's vote them out. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.